The woman's scream pierced the night as flames consumed the small homestead she had spent years building. Grace Holloway watched helplessly from the edge of the property as everything she owned turned to ash in the merciless blaze. Her hands were bloodied from her desperate attempts to salvage what she could before the men who set the fire had dragged her away, laughing as they threw her to the ground. Now, in the pale moonlight of 1876 Wyoming territory, she had nothing but the torn dress on her back and the locket around her neck. Morning came with cruel clarity. Grace sat on a fallen log, staring at the smoldering ruins. The attack wasn't random. Stanton Mining Company wanted her land, and this was their answer to her refusal to sell. Her father had died claiming this plot, building something from nothing on the edge of nowhere. Now it was gone. "Madam, you hurt." Grace looked up, startled by the deep voice. A tall man sat atop a chestnut stallion, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Dust covered his long coat, and a week's worth of stubble darkened his jaw. His eyes, though they were kind in a way she hadn't seen in months. "They're gone," she said, her voice hollow. "Those mining company men burned it all while I watched." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the earth. "Name's Mason Calloway," he said, approaching slowly like she was a spooked horse. Passing through to Broken Ridge, Grace studied him. His gun belt was worn but well-maintained, holster tied down to his thigh, a man familiar with using it. But there was no badge, no sign he was law. "Grace Holloway," she finally replied. "This was my home." Mason surveyed the destruction, his jaw tightening. "You have somewhere to go." She laughed bitterly. "They burned my things, everything I had." His eyes met hers, steady and determined. "Then I'll give you new memories." Grace stared at him, confusion replacing some of her despair. "What? First things first," Mason said, pulling a canteen from his saddle. "Drink. Then we talk about making this right." The water was cool against her parched throat. As she drank, Grace realized how numb she'd been, sitting through the night without food, water, or shelter. "I don't need charity," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Mason Calloway's mouth quirked up at one corner. "Good, because I'm not offering any. I'm offering justice. You a lawman, used to be, now I'm just a man who doesn't much care for bullies." He looked at the ruins again. "Stanton Mining, you said." Grace nodded. "They've been trying to drive me out for months. My land sits on the path they want for their new rail line. I wouldn't sell. So they decided to take matters into their own hands." Mason's voice hardened. "How many men?" "5, led by a man named Barrett. He works for Stanton directly." Mason offered his hand. "Miss Holloway, I suggest we ride to town, get you some clothes, food, and figure out our next steps." "Our next steps?" Grace hesitated before taking his hand. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said simply, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "I know you're a woman who stands her ground. That's rare enough these days." The ride to the small town of Elhorn was tense with Grace's awareness of the stranger's chest against her back. She hadn't been this close to a man since her fiancé died 2 years ago. Yet something about Mason Calloway's steady presence calmed her frayed nerves. "Why help me?" she asked as the town came into view, a collection of wooden buildings drowning in dust. "Maybe I'm tired of watching good people lose to men like Stanton," Mason replied, his breath warm against her ear. "Or maybe I've got my own score to settle." The town of Elhorn bustled with the usual morning activity, merchants opening shops, women hanging laundry, men heading to the mines or ranches. Grace felt exposed, acutely aware of her torn dress and soot-smudged face as Mason helped her dismount in front of a modest general store. Inside, the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Peterson, gasped at Grace's appearance. "Good heavens, child, what happened to you?" Mason stepped forward. "Mrs. Peterson, Miss Holloway's home was burned last night. She needs some necessities. Would you be kind enough to help her?" The older woman immediately took Grace by the arm. Of course, come with me, dear." While Grace was led to the back room, Mason spoke quietly with Mr. Peterson. By the time Grace emerged wearing a simple blue dress, her face washed clean, Mason had arranged for a room at the boarding house and purchased basic supplies. "You didn't need to," Grace began. "We'll settle accounts later," Mason interrupted. "Right now, we need to talk to the sheriff." Sheriff Tom Wilkes was a man whose girth suggested he spent more time at the saloon than on horseback. His office smelled of stale tobacco and indifference. He barely looked up from his desk when they entered. "Calloway," he acknowledged with a nod. "Heard you were passing through. Who's the lady?" Mason's voice was steady. "Grace Holloway. Her property was burned to the ground last night by Stanton Mining men." This got the sheriff's attention, though not in the way Grace had hoped. He shifted uncomfortably. "That's a serious accusation, miss. You got proof it was Stanton's men?" "I have eyes," Grace said sharply. "I recognized Barrett and his thugs. They dragged me out and made me watch while they destroyed everything." Sheriff Wilkes cleared his throat. "Well now, that's unfortunate, but what?" Mason cut in. "You're going to investigate, right?" The sheriff's gaze slid away. "Look, Stanton Mining brings a lot of business to this town. I can't just go accusing them without solid evidence." "She's a witness," Mason said, his hand moving subtly closer to his holster. "And they'll say she's mistaken or lying," Wilkes replied. 5 against 1. You know how these things go, Calloway." Grace felt the familiar burn of injustice. "So they get away with it, just like that." The sheriff had the decency to look embarrassed. "I'll ask around, that's all I can promise." Outside the sheriff's office, Grace fought back tears of frustration. "This is why they do it, because they know they can." Mason's face was grim as he led her toward the boarding house. "The law won't help us, but that doesn't mean we're helpless." In the modest room Mason had secured for her, Grace finally allowed herself to collapse onto the bed, the weight of her loss crushing down upon her. Mason remained by the door, giving her space. "I worked that land for 5 years after my father died," she said softly. "Built that cabin with my own hands. Everything I owned was in there: my mother's quilt, my father's pocket watch, letters from my fiancé before he was killed." Mason approached slowly, pulling a chair to sit across from her. "Tell me about Barrett and the others. What exactly happened?" Grace took a shuddering breath. "They came after sunset. I was making dinner. They pounded on the door, said it was my last chance to accept Stanton's offer." She twisted her hands in her lap. "When I refused, they dragged me out. Barrett held me while the others doused the cabin with kerosene." "They were laughing." Mason's eyes hardened. "Did they hurt you?" "Just some bruises. They wanted me alive to see it burn." Her voice cracked. "Barrett said it was a lesson in cooperation." "I need to make some inquiries," Mason said after a moment. "Will you be all right here for a few hours?" Grace straightened her shoulders. "I'm not some delicate flower, Mr. Calloway. I've survived worse." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I don't doubt that for a second." After Mason left, Grace washed properly and tried to rest, but her mind kept returning to the destruction of her home. What had begun as a dream, her father's dream of independence in the West, had turned to ash. The land was still hers, but without a home, without tools or supplies, what could she do? When Mason returned hours later, his expression was grim but determined. "Barrett and his men are staying at the Golden Spike Saloon," he said without preamble. "They're celebrating their handiwork." Grace felt her face flush with anger. "Of course they are. I also spoke with a man named Henry Mills at the land office. He confirmed Stanton has been buying up properties all along the planned rail route." Mason sat beside her. "You weren't the first to be driven off, just the most stubborn." "What good does knowing this do us?" Grace asked. "Knowledge is power, Miss Holloway." Mason reached into his coat and pulled out several folded papers. "These are records of Stanton's land acquisitions. Notice anything?" Grace studied the documents. "They're all signed by different officials, but the handwriting looks the same." Mason nodded. "Forged." Stanton's been falsifying documents, probably bribing officials. It's why the sheriff won't touch them. Either he's in Stanton's pocket or he's afraid. Hope flickered in Grace's chest. "Can we use this? Take it to a federal marshal, perhaps, eventually. But first, we need more evidence and leverage." Mason's eyes met hers. Which means we need to confront Barrett and his men. Grace felt a chill. That's dangerous. So is letting men like that believe they can burn a woman's home with impunity. Mason's voice was quiet but hard. I've got a plan, but I'll need your help. That evening, the Golden Spike Saloon buzzed with the usual crowd: miners, cowboys, and the women who entertained them. Barrett and his 4 companions occupied a corner table, cards and whiskey before them. Mason entered alone, taking a position at the bar where he could watch the men in the mirror behind the bottles. He nursed a whiskey, listening as the men grew louder and more boastful with each round. Should have seen her face, one of them laughed. Thought she was so high and mighty, telling Mr. Stanton he couldn't have her worthless piece of dirt. Barrett, a bull-necked man with small eyes, grinned. She'll be back, begging to take our offer now that she's got nothing. If she's smart, another added. Otherwise, accidents happen. Mason tightened his grip on his glass but maintained his calm facade. The plan required patience. Right on cue, the saloon doors swung open and Grace entered. She had transformed herself with Mrs. Peterson's help. Her hair was styled elegantly, her borrowed dress more fashionable than practical. She looked like a lady from back east, not a homesteader. Most importantly, Barrett and his men, having only seen her in the dark during the attack, didn't immediately recognize her. Grace made her way to the bar, positioning herself near Barrett's table. She ordered a drink, speaking loudly enough for the men to hear her refined accent another disguise. I'm looking for information about purchasing land in the area, she told the bartender. I understand the Stanton Mining Company has been acquiring properties. Barrett's head turned like a predator sensing prey. Mason watched as the man excused himself from his game and approached Grace. Couldn't help overhearing, madam, Barrett said with affected politeness. I happen to work for Stanton Mining. Edwin Barrett, at your service. Grace turned, her expression perfectly controlled despite facing the man who had destroyed her life. How fortunate. Perhaps you could answer some questions about the company's business practices. Barrett puffed up. Be happy to, miss. Westfield, Charlotte Westfield, she lied smoothly. I represent certain investors from Chicago interested in Western expansion. Barrett guided her to his table, introducing his companions. Mason kept watch, waiting for his moment. The plan was for Grace to extract information about Stanton's operations while pretending to be impressed by their aggressive acquisition strategies. Land acquisition can be complicated out here, Barrett was saying. Sometimes takes persuasion. Oh, Grace raised an eyebrow. What sort of persuasion? The men exchanged glances, already too drunk to be cautious. Let's just say we know how to clear obstacles, one of them snickered. Like that stubborn woman yesterday, another added before Barrett silenced him with a look. Grace leaned forward, feigning interest. Do tell, I'm very interested in efficient business methods. Barrett, eager to impress, lowered his voice. Some folks don't understand progress. Had to teach a lesson to a woman holding out on prime land just yesterday. A lesson, Grace prompted. Just a little fire, Barrett said with a cruel smile. Nothing that wasn't deserved. Mason saw Grace's composure falter slightly and decided it was time. He approached the table casually, as if just passing by, then stopped with exaggerated surprise. Miss Holloway, he said loudly. Is that you? Barrett's face drained of color as he looked between Mason and Grace, recognition dawning. Grace stood, dropping her charade. Yes, Mr. Calloway, she said coldly. I was just having an enlightening conversation with Mr. Barrett about how he burned my home to the ground last night. The saloon quieted as patrons turned to watch the confrontation. Barrett's men rose unsteadily to their feet, hands hovering near their weapons. I don't know what this woman's talking about, Barrett blustered. She's clearly deranged. Funny, Mason said. You just admitted to setting fire to a woman's property yesterday. How many homes did you burn, Barrett? Barrett's face flushed with anger. You're making a mistake, mister. Do you know who I work for? A coward who sends others to do his dirty work, Mason replied evenly. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to compensate Miss Holloway for her losses, and then you're going to leave town." Barrett laughed. "Or what?" Mason's movement was lightning fast. Before Barrett could react, Mason's gun was pressed against the man's temple. "Or I'll show you what a real lesson looks like." The other men reached for their weapons, but Grace's voice stopped them. "I wouldn't," she said, producing a small derringer from her purse. "I'm an excellent shot at this range." The tense standoff drew the sheriff, who pushed his way through the crowd. "What's going on here, Calloway?" Mason didn't lower his gun. "These men just confessed to burning Miss Holloway's home. We have witnesses." The saloon patrons murmured confirmation. The sheriff looked uncomfortable but couldn't ignore public testimony. "Is this true?" he demanded of Barrett. Barrett's eyes darted around, seeking escape. "We were just talking. She misunderstood." "He said they set a little fire to teach me a lesson," Grace stated firmly. Everyone here heard him. The sheriff reluctantly nodded. "Barrett, you and your men need to come with me. We've got some questions." "Sheriff, think about who signs your extra pay," Barrett hissed. "Careful," Mason warned, still holding his gun steady. "That sounds like admission of bribing a law officer." More murmurs rippled through the crowd. The sheriff, now aware his reputation was at stake, straightened his spine. "That's enough, all of you to the jail, now." As Barrett and his men were led away, Mason holstered his weapon and turned to Grace. That went better than expected. She was trembling slightly but managing a smile. "Will it stick, the charges? With this many witnesses, it has to." Mason guided her outside into the cool night air. "But we're not done yet." The next morning found them at the office of the Elhorn Gazette, the local newspaper. The editor, a young man named James Foster, listened intently as Grace recounted her story, from the initial pressure to sell to the destruction of her home. "And you have proof of Stanton Mining's methods?" Foster asked, scribbling notes. Mason produced the land documents. "Pattern of forgery, witness testimony of intimidation, and now arson. Barrett and his men are in custody, but Stanton himself is equally culpable." Foster whistled. "This is explosive. Stanton won't like it." "Stanton doesn't own the truth," Grace said firmly. "Or this town." "No, madam, he doesn't," Foster agreed with growing enthusiasm. "This could be the story that breaks his hold here." While Foster prepared his article, Mason and Grace headed to the telegraph office. Mason sent wires to federal marshals and a judge he knew in Cheyenne, detailing the situation and requesting intervention. "You seem to have connections," Grace observed as they left. Mason looked uncomfortable. "I told you I used to be a lawman. U.S. Marshal, actually. Left the badge behind 2 years ago after a disagreement with my superiors about how justice should work." "What happened?" He hesitated. "Similar situation. Powerful mining interests driving out small farmers. I was ordered to enforce eviction notices I knew were based on forged documents. I refused." Grace studied him with new understanding. "So this is personal for you." "Justice always is," he replied simply. They spent the day gathering additional testimony from other landowners who had been pressured by Stanton. By evening, Sheriff Wilkes found himself facing mounting evidence and public opinion. Barrett and his men remained locked up, and a federal marshal was expected within days. Back at the boarding house, Grace sat on the edge of her bed, exhaustion finally catching up to her. "Even if Barrett is convicted," she said quietly, "my home is still gone." Mason leaned against the doorframe. "Yes, but you still have your land. And I'd wager the people of Elhorn might be willing to help rebuild once they know the full story." "Why would they? I'm a stranger to most." "Because people are tired of living under Stanton's thumb. Your stand might just be the thing that breaks his hold here." Mason hesitated. "And you won't be alone." Grace looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I said I'd help you build new memories," he reminded her. "I intend to keep that promise if you'll let me." For the first time since the fire, Grace felt something other than despair. "You barely know me, Mr. Calloway." "I know enough," he said again, echoing his words from their first meeting. "And I'd like to know more if you're willing." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Foster's newspaper article caused a sensation, not just in Elkhorn but in neighboring towns as well. Telegraph wires hummed with the story of Grace Holloway's stand against Stanton Mining. Federal Marshal Daniel Reed arrived from Cheyenne, bringing with him the weight of government authority. Barrett and his men were transferred to federal custody, facing charges of arson, intimidation, and conspiracy. More significantly, Edmund Stanton himself was summoned to Elkhorn to answer questions about his company's practices. The mining magnate arrived in a private rail car, outraged to find himself under scrutiny rather than controlling events as usual. Grace stood tall as she testified before Marshal Reed, recounting the months of pressure and the final violent act against her property. Mason sat in the back of the makeshift courtroom, a steady presence that gave her strength. When Stanton took the stand, his composure cracked under Reed's relentless questioning. The land documents Mason had discovered proved damning, especially when compared to legitimate deeds. By the hearing's end, Stanton was facing multiple federal charges and his company's operations were suspended pending investigation. "It's not over," Mason warned Grace as they left the hearing. "Men like Stanton have resources, connections." "I know," she replied, "but it's a beginning." True to Mason's prediction, the people of Elkhorn rallied around Grace once the truth was known. Mr. Peterson organized a collection for rebuilding supplies. Ranchers offered lumber from their lands. Even Sheriff Wilkes, eager to redeem himself, volunteered to help with construction. 2 weeks after the fire, Grace stood on her property once more, watching as the foundation for a new cabin took shape. Mason worked alongside the volunteers, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his forearms as he set posts with practiced efficiency. "Never seen a former marshal swing a hammer like that," Grace commented as she brought him water. Mason accepted the dipper gratefully. "Wasn't always a marshal. Grew up building things with my father before the war changed everything." "The war changed a lot of things for a lot of people," Grace agreed softly. As April turned to May, the cabin rose steadily from the ashes of the old one. Mason stayed in Elkhorn, taking odd jobs to support himself while spending most days helping with the reconstruction. In the evenings, he and Grace would sit on the partially built porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "My fiancé, Thomas, died in a mining accident 2 years ago," Grace told him one evening. "That's when I decided to come west and help my father with his homestead." He passed 6 months later. Everyone said I should sell and go back east, but this land was his dream, and then it became mine. Mason listened, understanding in his eyes. "My wife Sarah died in childbirth while I was away on Marshal business, our daughter with her. I wasn't there when they needed me most." Grace's hand found his in the gathering darkness. "Is that why you left the badge behind?" "Partly. I realized I'd been so focused on upholding the law that I'd forgotten what justice really means, what matters." His fingers tightened around hers. "I've been drifting ever since." "Until now?" she asked softly. His eyes met hers. "Until now." The new cabin was larger than the original, with proper windows ordered from Cheyenne and a stone fireplace that would hold heat through the Wyoming winters. Mason insisted on building a separate stable for horses and a root cellar that could double as shelter during storms. "Planning for every possibility," Grace observed as they inspected the cellar's progress. "Something I learned as a marshal," Mason replied. "Always good to have options when trouble comes." And trouble did come, though not as they expected. In early June, a rider arrived from Elkhorn with news that Edmund Stanton had been released on bail pending his trial. He had immediately fired Barrett and his men, claiming no knowledge of their unauthorized actions. "He's protecting himself," Mason said grimly after the rider left, cutting loose the men who could implicate him. Grace felt a chill despite the summer warmth. "Will Barrett talk?" "Not if Stanton's lawyers get to him first." Mason paced the newly laid wooden floor. "This changes things." That night, Mason insisted on staying at the partially finished cabin rather than returning to town. He made a bedroll on the porch while Grace slept inside on her new bed, one of the few pieces of furniture already in place. She was awakened just before dawn by the sound of approaching horses. Mason was already alert, his gun drawn as he moved silently to her bedside. "Company," he whispered. "At least 3 riders." Grace grabbed her father's old shotgun from beside the bed. "Barrett, can't tell, stay inside." Mason moved to the window, keeping to the shadows. The riders stopped at the edge of the clearing. 3 men dismounted, but they weren't Barrett and his thugs. They wore the distinctive jackets of Stanton Mining Company security. "Miss Holloway," one called out, "we have a message from Mr. Stanton." Mason and Grace exchanged glances. She nodded and Mason opened the door, stepping onto the porch with his gun held casually at his side. "Miss Holloway is listening," he said. The lead man eyed Mason's weapon, but continued. "Mr. Stanton regrets the misunderstanding about your property. He wishes to make amends by offering double his original price for your land." "No misunderstanding," Grace said, appearing in the doorway behind Mason. "Your employer sent men to burn me out." Mr. Stanton had no knowledge of Mr. Barrett's actions, the man insisted. "He's prepared to be very generous to avoid further unpleasantness." Mason's voice hardened. "Sounds like a threat," the man shrugged. "Just delivering a message and an offer. Mr. Stanton says to remind you that legal proceedings can be lengthy, costly, and uncertain. This offer expires in 3 days." After the men departed, Grace slumped onto a chair. "He's trying to buy his way out of this and intimidate you into dropping your testimony," Mason agreed. "But there's something else bothering him. He wouldn't double his offer unless he was desperate." They rode into town later that day to consult with Marshal Reed, who had established a temporary office in Elhorn. The Marshal confirmed their suspicions. "Stanton's worried about more than just your case," Reed explained. "Your story has inspired others to come forward. Homesteaders, small ranchers, even some of his own former employees. The evidence is mounting." "So his offer is just another attempt to silence me," Grace said. Reed nodded. "And to secure that land, which makes me wonder, why is your particular property so important to him?" This question led them to the land office, where Henry Mills reluctantly shared maps of the proposed rail line. "Your property sits at a crucial junction," Mills pointed out. "Without it, they'd have to reroute miles around a series of ridges, adding considerable expense." Mason studied the maps closely. "There's something else here. This geological survey, see these markings, that's not just about a rail line." Mills shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Stanton had those surveys done privately." "Let me guess," Mason pressed. "Gold deposits or copper?" Mills' silence was confirmation enough. "My land has mineral deposits," Grace realized. "That's why he's been so persistent." "And why he doubled his offer," Mason added. "The land is worth far more than he's letting on." Armed with this knowledge, they returned to the cabin with renewed determination. The rebuilding continued, now with an added sense of purpose. Grace was fighting not just for her home, but for justice against a man who had exploited and bullied an entire community. As June progressed, the cabin neared completion. Mason and Grace fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day, talking into the night. Their shared experience had forged a bond neither had expected. One evening, as they sat on the finished porch watching fireflies dance over the meadow, Mason reached for her hand. "I came to Wyoming looking for something, though I wasn't sure what," he said quietly. "Now I know." Grace turned to face him, heart quickening. "And what did you find, Mr. Calloway?" A reason to stop drifting. His eyes held hers. "If you'll have me." Instead of answering, Grace leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I'll take that as a yes," he whispered. Their newfound happiness was interrupted the next day when a rider brought urgent news from town. Barrett had been found dead in his cell in Cheyenne, apparently by his own hand, though the circumstances were suspicious. Convenient for Stanton, Mason observed grimly. His main liability silenced. Marshal Reed arrived later that afternoon, his expression grave. Barrett's death complicates things. The other men are changing their stories, claiming they acted alone without orders from Barrett or Stanton. They've been bought, Grace said bitterly, or threatened, Mason added. What about the land documents, the forgeries? Reed sighed. Stanton's lawyers are claiming clerical errors, not fraud, without Barrett's testimony linking Stanton directly to the intimidation campaign. The case is falling apart, Grace finished for him. Not entirely, Reed assured them. We still have your testimony and the physical evidence of the arson, but Stanton himself may escape the more serious charges. After Reed left, Mason paced the cabin floor while Grace sat at the new table, trying to process this setback. He can't just get away with this, she said finally. He won't, Mason's voice was iron. One way or another, Stanton will pay for what he's done. The determination in his eyes worried Grace. Mason, don't do anything reckless. I couldn't bear to lose you too. His expression softened as he knelt before her. You won't lose me. But I won't let him destroy what we're building here either. The next morning, they were awakened by the sound of multiple wagons approaching. Grace peered out the window to see at least a dozen men from Stanton Mining, along with surveyors and equipment. Mason was already pulling on his boots. Stay inside, he ordered, buckling on his gun belt. Like hell, Grace replied, grabbing her shotgun. This is my land. Together, they stepped onto the porch as the procession halted at the edge of the property. Edmund Stanton himself emerged from the lead wagon, a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit entirely unsuited to the Wyoming wilderness. Miss Holloway, he called, approaching with affected geniality. I see you've rebuilt, very industrious. You're trespassing, Stanton, Mason said coldly. Stanton's smile didn't reach his eyes. Merely visiting a neighbor, I understand you declined my generous offer. Not interested in any offer from the man who ordered my home burned, Grace replied. A tragic misunderstanding, as I've explained. Stanton gestured to the men and equipment. However, time is money. The railroad won't wait, and neither will progress. Mason stepped forward. You have no right to be on this land. Perhaps not yet. Stanton's facade dropped, revealing the ruthless man beneath. But with Barrett's unfortunate passing, your case against my company is crumbling. It's only a matter of time before I acquire this property one way or another. Is that another threat? Grace demanded. Simply a statement of fact. The territorial governor is a personal friend. The judge assigned to hear your case is another. Your federal marshal is outmatched and outgunned. Stanton's cold eyes moved between them. I always get what I want, Miss Holloway. Mason's hand hovered near his holster. Not this time. The tension was broken by the sound of more horses approaching Marshal Reed, accompanied by several deputies and, surprisingly, James Foster from the newspaper with his camera equipment. Problem here, Miss Holloway, Reed called as they rode up. Mr. Stanton was just leaving, Grace replied firmly. Stanton's face darkened as he noticed Foster setting up his camera. What is this? Documenting history, Foster replied cheerfully. The Elhorn Gazette is now syndicated with papers in Denver and San Francisco. Your intimidation tactics make quite compelling news, Mr. Stanton. Reed dismounted casually. And I've brought something that might interest you. He pulled a sealed document from his coat. Federal injunction preventing any Stanton Mining employee from approaching within 1 mile of the Holloway property pending resolution of all charges. Stanton snatched the paper, scanning it furiously. This is outrageous. I'll have it overturned immediately. You're welcome to try, Reed said. In the meantime, you and your men need to withdraw. This isn't over, Stanton hissed at Grace before storming back to his wagon. As Stanton's procession retreated, Foster's camera captured the moment Grace and Mason standing defiant before their rebuilt home. the mining magnate in humiliating retreat. That photograph will run in 20 newspapers by week's end, Foster promised with satisfaction. Reed stayed behind after the others left, sharing more news. Barrett left a letter, he told them quietly. Found hidden in his cell after his death. Names, dates, explicit orders from Stanton regarding intimidation tactics against landowners like yourself. Hope surged in Grace's chest. So the case isn't lost, far from it, Reed confirmed. Barrett may have sensed he was in danger. The letter was insurance and now it's evidence. Stanton doesn't know about it yet. Will it be enough? Mason asked. Combined with everything else, I believe so. Reed mounted his horse. Stanton's visit today only strengthens our case. Violating a federal order won't sit well with the judge. After Reed departed, Grace and Mason stood in silence, processing this unexpected turn of events. We might actually win this, Grace said wonderingly. Mason pulled her into his arms. Was there ever any doubt? The summer passed in a blur of legal proceedings, rebuilding, and deepening feelings between Grace and Mason. Barrett's letter proved devastating to Stanton's defense. Other former employees came forward, emboldened by Barrett's posthumous testimony. By August, the cabin was fully completed, a proper home with furniture crafted by local woodworkers, curtains sewn by the women of Elhorn, and a garden beginning to yield its first vegetables. Mason had built a workshop behind the cabin where he crafted furniture and repaired tools for neighboring homesteaders. The federal case against Stanton Mining concluded in early September. Edmund Stanton was found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and multiple violations of territorial law. His company's assets were frozen, its operations suspended. The man himself faced prison time. On a golden September afternoon, Grace stood in her garden, harvesting the last of the summer tomatoes when Mason approached, looking uncharacteristically nervous. I've been thinking, he began, twisting his hat in his hands. Grace smiled. A dangerous pastime for a man like you. Funny, he replied with a half smile before growing serious again. This land, this home, it's yours. I've never presumed otherwise. Mason, let me finish, he interrupted gently. I promised you new memories to replace what was lost. I hope I've kept that promise. You have, she assured him softly, many times over. He took a deep breath. Then I'd like to make one more promise, a lifetime of memories, if you'll have me. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold ring. It was my mother's, he explained. I've carried it since Sarah died, waiting for, I didn't know what, until I found you. Grace set down her basket of tomatoes, her hands trembling slightly. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Mason Calloway? He dropped to one knee in the soft earth of her garden. Grace Holloway, will you marry me, build a life with me, create memories that fire can never destroy? Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times yes. The wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees turned the hills to gold. The entire town of Elhorn attended, along with Marshal Reed and many of the homesteaders who had found justice because of Grace's stand against Stanton. James Foster documented the event for his newspaper, the headline reading, Love rises from ashes. Holloway-Calloway wedding symbolizes triumph over tyranny. After the celebrations, Mason carried Grace across the threshold of their cabin, no longer just her home, but theirs. Welcome home, Mrs. Calloway, he murmured against her hair. I've been home since the moment you found me sitting in the ashes, she replied, drawing his mouth down to hers. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Grace traced the scars on Mason's chest, remnants of his years upholding the law in lawless territories. What happens now? She asked. With Stanton in prison and justice served, Mason's fingers tangled in her unbound hair. We live, we build. We create those memories I promised you. And the land, it's still yours, ours, and now we know it contains copper deposits. He propped himself on one elbow. We could develop it ourselves, responsibly, create jobs for the town, build something lasting. Grace smiled up at him. Mason Calloway, I do believe you're becoming an entrepreneur. Just a man with a future now, he corrected, pulling her close. A future with you. Spring came to Wyoming once more. The meadow surrounding the Calloway cabin exploded with wildflowers. Grace stood on the porch, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly, as she watched Mason working with their new foreman, planning the small copper mining operation that would soon begin on the far edge of their property. The past year had brought changes no one could have predicted. Stanton remained in prison, his empire dismantled. The railroad had been rerouted, respecting the property rights of the homesteaders it had once sought to displace. Elhorn was thriving, with new businesses opening as families settled in the region. And here, on the land that had nearly been taken from her, Grace had found more happiness than she had ever thought possible. Mason looked up from his work, catching her watching him. With a word to the foreman, he strode toward the house, his face lighting up as it always did when he saw her. "How are my girls today?" he asked, placing his hand over hers on her belly. "Restless," Grace replied with a smile. "She takes after her father." Mason kissed her gently. "Let's hope she has her mother's spirit. The world needs more women willing to stand their ground." Grace leaned into his embrace, remembering that first day when she had sat alone among the ashes of her old life. "Do you remember what you said to me when we first met, when I told you they had burned everything?" Mason nodded, his arms tightening around her. "I said I'd give you new memories." "You gave me so much more," Grace whispered, turning in his arms to face him. "You gave me a new life." As the sun set over the Wyoming horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Mason Calloway held his wife close, marveling at how a chance encounter with a stubborn, courageous woman had transformed his life of endless wandering into something rich with purpose and love. And Grace, her head resting against his chest, listened to the steady beat of his heart and knew that while fire might destroy possessions, it could never touch what truly mattered: the love they had built from the ashes, stronger and more enduring than anything that had come before.